One good method for studying the Bible is to go through the text and write down a summary of each paragraph or verse, and then see how they fit together. It helps us to see the big ideas and the movement in the text from one idea to another. I would summarize verses 1 to 15 as: verse 1, we have the kind of book title or introduction. Verses 2 to 3, it describes John as the messenger before God. Verse 4, we have John's baptism, and verse 5 is many people coming to be baptized by John. Verse 6, there's a description of John. Verse 7, John's message about Jesus. Verse 8, John's baptism versus Jesus' baptism. Verses 9 to 11, Jesus baptized by John. Verses 12 to 13, the temptation of Jesus. And verses 14 to 15, the message of Jesus, which is kind of a bridge into the next section. If we look at these last three sections, so that's verses 9 to 15, they are focused primarily on Jesus. So we will save these for next time. The content of verses 2 to 8 is easily summarized into two key themes: John as the messenger and the baptism of John. The first section about John as the messenger provides the background to the second section about John as the messenger. In the same way, the first section about baptism provides the background to the second section about baptism. Since we have already done the first section on the theme of messenger, I want to look at the second section in verses 6 to 7. In the next video, we will focus specifically on baptism. When we studied verses 2 to 3, we saw that John was special. He was like the other messengers of God in the Old Testament, but greater. He was the messenger that comes before God when God finally comes and brings his salvation. Now let's look at verse 6. The first thing we should notice about this description is that all these things show us that John lives in the wilderness. He's not just visiting. John lives off the land. His food is what can be found in the wilderness. His clothes are the clothes that people wear who live in the wild. This is interesting because often a messenger in some aspects symbolizes the one who sent them, specifically if it's for an important person. The messengers of kings dress in beautiful clothes. The messengers of business dress in smart suits. But God's messenger dresses in camel's hair. So from this, we start to see a shocking fact: that when God comes to his people, he will be like his messenger. He will not come in great splendor, but in humility and poverty. And this is a very important point, because God's ways are not the ways of the world. God does not want us to be focused on the outside things. We should not be impressed by clothes and riches. We should focus on the inside things. Our heart and what we speak from our heart is important to God, and it should be important to us too. So don't look at John's clothes, listen to what he says. John is not the first servant of God to be poor. If we read the Bible, we will see that most of them were really, really poor. In Hebrews 11, we find a great description of them. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. So don't make the mistake of thinking that by being a Christian you can get rich. Equally, don't think that riches are a sign of God's blessing. But if you are poor and struggling in life, don't worry or think this is because you are far from God. The reality is you're in good company. Jesus and John were both poor. We should also note here that whilst Mark is showing us John's lifestyle, this is also very symbolic. In the first section of 2 Kings, the same words are used to describe Elijah. Mark is using these words to show us that John is like Elijah. And if we look at one of the background texts from last time, we can see why. So in Malachi chapter 4 verse 5, God says, Behold, I send to you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers. In fact, Luke says the same thing about John in Luke chapter 1 verse 17. Later, Mark will deal with the exact relationship between John and Elijah in Mark chapter 9 at the Transfiguration. Here the focus is not primarily on John, but on Jesus, and so when Mark is emphasizing that John is this Elijah figure, he's really emphasizing how Jesus is God, the Lord who comes after his messenger Elijah. In verse 7, we can see this method of emphasizing John in order to emphasize Jesus more clearly. John is this great special messenger that is greater than all other messengers, but he is unworthy. If even John is unworthy, how great must Jesus be? Here a little bit of cultural background will be useful. In those days the streets were filthy, and so feet were often very dirty. Nobody wanted to touch them. So apparently, untying a visitor's sandals and washing their feet was the job of the lowest slave. John is saying here he is not worthy enough to be the lowest slave in Jesus' house or to do the lowest job for Jesus. Now, if John is not worthy to do even the lowest thing for Jesus, should we ever complain about serving Jesus? It's a privilege. If John is not worthy, we are certainly not worthy. How dare we ever look at work that we do for Jesus and think that it's beneath us? The final thing that I want to note here is the word mighty. This has always shocked me. In our church culture, we often talk about Jesus as humble, forgiving, or as a friend. But that's not the emphasis here. It's on Jesus' might, his strength and power. In fact, if you've read the Gospels carefully, this is the primary lens through which they show us Jesus. And the first verse of Mark's Gospel gives us the reason. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of David. He is the Messiah, the great Saviour of his people, who will destroy his enemies. He is the one in the Old Testament that will establish his kingdom on earth and fulfill the promises of God. And Mark, at the beginning of this Gospel, emphasizes this point because he wants to orient our perspective. He is giving us a view of Jesus that will help us to understand what happens next. You see, it's only by understanding the greatness of Jesus that we can understand how amazing it was that Jesus forgave sinners and ate with them. When we think about how supreme Jesus is, it makes it incredible that he would spend his time caring for the poor and healing the unclean. In fact, when we consider the great might of Jesus, that he would allow himself to be killed in a really violent, degrading way, and that he did that for his enemies, it's almost unbelievable.